I would love to know a little bit about yawning actually. So, what's going on with the yawn? And from a behavioural point of view, why do you think it's contagious with other people as well? So, if you could unpack a bit of that for us to start us off.
Well, I must say that's an unexpected question, but I can give you my opinion.
Yes,
It's not
please.
based on research. To me, yawning is kind of a punctuation point in, what we might be doing at a particular time. I think it's related to making a change in what we're thinking about or what we're going to do. I think it's a physical thing, of course, but there's a lot of psychology in it
Mm,
when we start to yawn. I don't think there's any clear-cut explanation for it that's been well accepted by any particular group of people. There are all kinds of opinions about it. You find that it's correlated with things, like
mm,
yawning is often correlated with dysfunctional breathing, for example. And why it's correlated with that is another question, but it's one of those symptoms that you can point to as being evidence for something else going on. In essence, I think of it as a kind of a punctuation point that's a psychophysiologically driven phenomenon. But
mhm.
thank you for asking that. I'm rarely caught off guard, but you did on
Okay.
that one because I don't have any clear answers for you.
No, that's okay. I mean, and I've not been able to find anything either. So I thought, let's see what comes up. From a CO2 perspective, though, is there? Because I think we're in a bit of a simplification place in breath work at the minute. People are very clear on, oh, it's nose only or mouth only, and things
Hmm.
get driven down to the most simplest points. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And so,
It
is there a
certainly is.
danger that yawning is yawning causing a CO2 problem or not?
What regulates CO2 are some basic reflexes. Okay, and then the psychology of breathing often gets in the way of those reflexes. So that we end up compromising our respiration because CO2 is really a measurement of what's going on from a respiratory perspective. That it's the only way, if you monitor CO2 live with a capnometer, you're really monitoring respiration. It's really the only instrument that you can monitor real-time respiration with because it really looks at the chemistry of what's going on. Because respiration, to separate it from breathing, they're really two different things for me,
Mhm.
very different things, obviously highly related, but they are different from each other. And respiration, one of the chief functions of it is to regulate pH, to regulate body chemistry, specifically extracellular fluids. You're looking at blood, you're looking at lymph, you're looking at cerebral spinal fluid, you're looking at interstitial fluids, which are the fluids around the cells of the body. And those reflexes are driven by the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood and the cerebral spinal fluid, by the oxygen concentration in the plasma of the blood, and also the pH of the blood, and then the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid. All those things together are what driving it. It's not sighing that's driving it, or mouth breathing that's driving it, or nasal breathing, or any of those kinds of things. It's really the fundamental chemistry, and we need to stay out of the way of that chemistry if we can, because you get problems otherwise.
Mm,
And so that's what one of the things that we have a great interest in is aligning the mechanics of breathing with the chemistry of the respiration. So when you talk about things like behavioral things like sighing and mouth breathing and so on, those aren't the things that are regulating the CO2 level at all. It's the chemistry that's regulating it. Now you get correlations between different kinds of mechanics and respiratory changes. Like, for example, you'll find that people who breathe fast are more likely to be those people who have compromised respiration than people who breathe slowly. But it's not that fast breathing leads to these dysfunctional kinds of respiration. It doesn't. It's just correlated with it. If I worry about getting enough air, I may breathe faster to try to get it. I may take larger breaths. I may open my mouth because I'm worried about getting enough air. And so I do all the things that I think somehow are going to facilitate that. And it's not necessarily what I think, it's rather what I've learned unconsciously to do. And when I do that, I get into trouble, and you find correlations between all those kinds of mechanics and a respiratory compromise. And so people often draw faulty conclusions like, mouth breathing creates overbreathing. That's simply not true. For example, very often when I see someone, and I'm working with people because I'm monitoring their CO2 levels full time, in real time, looking at what they're doing. And I see that they're overventilating and they've compromised their respiration, they've compromised their acid-base balance. I can see that live on the screen. I'll ask them to open their mouths just a little bit. And when I do that, very often the CO2 just returns to normal. And it takes about 2 or 3 minutes. If you're down, if your CO2 level's down, it takes time to get it back. So in 2 or 3 minutes, I can see it completely normalize. You say, my God, how can that be? Well, just ask your client. Ask them. So I ask them, I say, how do you feel? How do you feel after opening your mouth? What kind of experience is that for you? And the person may say, oh, what a relief. I mean, that really felt good. I didn't have to really focus on my breathing anymore. What do you mean you don't have to focus on your breathing anymore? Well, I'm always worried about getting enough air, and I find myself focusing on it. When I do that, I get kind of breathless, and I don't really like to focus on my breathing. It's really hard for me. And when I opened my mouth like that, I just didn't have to worry about it anymore. And so they stopped trying to control the breath, because one of the problems is that people try to control the breath, and in that process of controlling, they take that away from the reflex mechanisms that know what to do. That intelligence is built in. And that taking away, that control that comes into the picture is usually unconscious. It's usually automatic, okay? Because habits, we're talking about breathing habits, and breathing habits are unconscious kinds of activities, physiological activities. They're configurations of physiology that take place on a reflex basis, based on learning. And so very often you're just not in touch with the behaviors, the breathing behaviors that you've learned, and how they're coordinating with the respiratory process or not. So when you look at mechanics, there are various kinds of mechanics that are correlated with different kinds of respiratory considerations because of the learning, the habits behind those things. And it's the psychology that drives those habits very often. And we can talk all about that as we get into this. But I've given you a long answer to your question.
Hey, just pausing the podcast for 2 seconds. Do us a quick favour. Leave us a comment down below. Let us know something that you've learned or enjoyed from this show so far. In doing so, it appeals to the YouTube gods, and it means more people are likely to find this podcast. Also, it's going to help you remember whatever it is that you've enjoyed so far. And anybody scrolling the comments are also going to get some benefits as well. So help us out, and let's get back on with the show. Cheers.
Really good. And I think, again, this flies against a lot of the mainstream breathwork information that seems to have been out over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So let me give you this an example then. Person breaks their nose, it's all bunged up and bandaged up, and they have to mouth breathe. During that period of time, would you assume that they've become more dysfunctional and they're blowing off more CO2?
No,
or not?
No, I wouldn't think so. No, unless there's an issue, you see, around the nose itself, where the person is normally breathing through the nose, and now they have to breathe through the mouth. You get the psychology of that coming into the situation where the person is concerned about that. They don't like breathing through the nose. They prefer breathing through. They don't like breathing through the mouth. They prefer breathing through the nose. And they can't, so they find themselves struggling. And when you struggle, you normally reach for control. You're concerned with control. There may be belief systems. Am I getting enough air? Is my breathing right? It doesn't seem right to me. And so there's a lot of focus on the breathing. And as they focus on the breathing, and they may start manipulating it in various ways based on some recipe of breathing they've heard about, or something they're supposed to do, or they're not doing something right, and they get involved in it, because when you get involved in controlling the breathing, that often is the problem that has to be solved around people who breathe dysfunctionally. They're trying to control it all the time. And what's unfortunate is that when they go to someone often who's a breathing kind of expert, or they're doing breathing in their work, they may recommend some other way of controlling the breathing. And so the very basis for the problem, that is the person's trying to control it, is addressed by teaching them some other way to control it. When in fact the solution is where they were before they broke their nose, where they were just allowing the breathing and they're not involved in it. And we're assuming there's no unconscious habit that's been learned, so they're breathing normally when they're in their mouth, but now this isn't normal for them. So they're now reaching for some kind of solution to this strange feeling. So, and they get into trouble when they do that.
Okay, so with the nose, I've studied Patrick McEwen's work quite a lot. So Buteyko, oxygen advantage. So this is fascinating for me to have this discussion. So the things that I understand around the nose being a smaller hole, filtering, moistening. So around 42% less moisture. I understand from Patrick.
Well, it's very important to breathe in the nose. I mean, hopefully people prefer to breathe in the nose rather than through the mouth. There's a lot of benefits of breathing through the nose, but it doesn't have much to do with respiration. It has to do with things like you just mentioned, moisture and so on. And there's a lot of talk about nitric oxide, right? You no doubt have heard about that. Well, the nitric oxide that's produced in the nose is not used body-wide. Nitric oxide is produced all over the body. It's in the epithelium of the vasculature. It's fundamental to the whole system. The fact that it's produced in the nose is not unique. It's produced everywhere. And the nitric oxide that's produced in the nose is a local phenomenon. And sure, if you breathe through the nose, you breathe in the nitric oxide into the lungs. And there's speculation, it's hypothesized, that that's a healthy thing because it's a dilator. And from that perspective, it may be important, say, particularly with someone who has lung disease or something like that. But its actual role in the lungs isn't very well known. If you look at reviews of nitric oxide produced in the nose, because locally it's an important thing here, but getting it into the lungs, exactly how it serves someone isn't well established if you look at the literature on it. And so there's lots of talk about how the nose is essential to producing nitric oxide all over the body, and this just isn't true. Nitric oxide is not distributed throughout the body as a function of the nose. It gets into the lungs, and its exact role is speculative. People feel it's an important piece of chemistry in terms of good lung function, but it isn't well established. But otherwise in the body where nitric oxide is produced, it's critical. In fact, if you overventilate and you lose carbon dioxide, the hemoglobin compound that consists of nitric oxide, where the hemoglobin actually carries nitric oxide in a particular chemical form, that when there's a lot of CO2, because you're not overventilating and there's normal CO2 getting into the red blood cell, then when the oxygen is released as a function of that, then nitric oxide is also released. And then you have the effect of the CO2 directly on the epithelium of the vasculature, and it plays a major role in the production of nitric oxide locally within the vascular system, so that you get vasodilation. When there's CO2 in the vasculature, like in the brain, you get vasodilation. And when CO2 is diminished, then you get vasoconstriction. And the nitric oxide and the relationship between carbon dioxide and nitric oxide is critical there. It has everything to do with that vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So that's where the nitric oxide becomes important. It's internally within the system as a whole, like in the brain. It has nothing to do with the nitric oxide produced in the nose.
Gotcha. So mouth versus nose, just to put this bit to bed then, if we switch between the two, are you saying then that that's having very little effect on the respiration and what's going on chemically?
Well, you see, it's really the psychophysiology of it, because that's not regulating the respiration. Respiration is not regulated by that. It's regulated by its requirements. Its requirements center around pH. center around oxygen concentration and carbon dioxide concentration, because that's all about acid-base balance. There's an equation anybody who does breath work should know. It's called the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, the HH equation. And this is all about respiration. Its pH is equal to bicarbonate concentration regulated by the kidneys divided by CO2 concentration, which is regulated by the way that you're breathing, okay, whether you're taking larger breaths, smaller breaths, whatever it is you're doing, because you need to maintain the correct concentration of carbon dioxide in the alveoli of the lungs at all times, or as much as possible. Okay, because by maintaining the right concentration in the alveoli of the lungs, that when blood then comes through the lungs, then where the capillary makes contact with the alveoli where there's gas exchange, if you have the right level of CO2 in the alveoli, when the blood comes through with a much higher level of CO2, then it's going to give off, you're going to get equilibration, where the CO2 is going to come off from the blood into the alveoli of the lungs, and it's going to give up the amount of carbon dioxide so that it's equilibrated, so that the carbon dioxide that's returned to the blood is equivalent to the concentration in the alveoli. So whatever you keep in the alveoli is what you get in the blood. So if you start taking breaths that are a little bit too large, you're going to reduce the concentration of the carbon dioxide in the alveoli immediately. And when you do that, as the blood comes through, it's going to give off more carbon dioxide than it should. It should be maintaining a higher level. And that level is what's regulating the pH. So the pH in that equation, that HH equation, will change just like that as a function of dropping that CO2. You reduce the concentration, that is the percentage of the carbon dioxide gas as compared to the percentage of the total. So it should be about 5%, which is about 30 millimeters of partial pressure, what we call carbon dioxide, millimeters mercury. And you want to maintain in the alveoli, whether you're exercising, whether you're doing meditation, it doesn't make any difference. You want the concentration at about 5%. And when that's true, when the blood leaves the lungs, it's going to leave with that same level that you're maintaining in the alveoli. So as you manipulate the mechanics in whatever way you do, for whatever other reasons, then you're going to disturb that balance. That pH is going to go wrong, and then you're going to get all kinds of symptoms associated with that. You can get radical symptoms. If you look at the literature, what it shows is about 60% of the ambulance runs in the big cities in the United States are a consequence of precisely that. That is, their CO2 levels drop down a bit and they get these wild symptoms. They don't know where those symptoms are coming from. They get panicked, they get worried, they think they're having a heart attack, they can't breathe, they have this symptom and that, and they call emergency in this country 911, and they get an ambulance and they're in the hospital. That's 60% of the ambulance runs. And what do they get when they get there? They get, a paper bag to breathe into. They get a prescription. They get a referral, but they don't get help. No one knows why they're breathing that way, where that came from, what was it that happened that the breathing went awry in that particular moment and they called emergency, ended up in the hospital. They really don't get any help. None at all. That's one of the reasons I got into all this. When I saw those statistics, I could hardly believe it. Just amazing.
I mean, that is it's shocking, a shocking high percentage of people being rushed to the hospital on that. There's so many ways. I know some very well-known healthcare people who are real experts in pulmonary physiology who suffer exactly from that themselves. It's extremely common, and it's regulated by habits because habits are triggered. So it's not like you're breathing a particular way all the time. You're changing it off. You're changing it all the time. Look at my posture. Look at my hand.
Look at my head. Look at this position. This is learned. Look how my thumb is open, my fingers are stretched out. And when I start talking, look how I move my head, I move my hands again and my eyes. All of this is, these are unconscious habits. Look how I'm going back and forth here. I'm noticing it as I do it. My head is cocked, and so on. Breathing is the same way. And it's constantly changing as a function of the different triggers that regulate it based on a whole learning history I have. Breathing is a beautiful example of how we learn all kinds of unconscious behaviors that are regulated by specific triggers. So you breathe this way over here and you breathe that way over there. So you're fine most of the time, but then you overventilate and lose CO2 when you go up to stand in front of your audience. You're going to present to 100 people in an auditorium, and everything is fine until you've gotten behind, the curtains and you're getting ready to go out, but now you start overventilating, CO2 level drops, you become disoriented, you can't function. I can go into all the physiology of that, how you get disinhibition in the brain. You can get a restriction of blood flow of up to 50% in the brain in a matter of seconds, and now you can't function. And it's always when you go up to stand in front of people when you're going to make a speech, and that's the trigger. Or it could be a trigger like when you start to do your sport. You're fine, but as soon as you start to exert energy just like that, your CO2 level drops like a rock. So we've worked with the U.S. Special Forces, we work with Navy SEALs, with LA Police Department does our work. Their SWAT team has got recently interested in the British Navy is now interested in it. What the British Navy did, just to show you how it gets triggered, they were wearing capnometers and they were recording the levels of CO2, and they were on one of those simulations where they go on shore all dressed in their equipment, and they're in there with their rifles and everything else, and everything is simulated, but it's about as close to real as you can get. And there were bombs that had to be diffused and so on, and they were tracking the CO2 levels, and they found that the people, when the CO2 level dropped radically in certain soldiers, when there were certain points in their challenge, certain points where it was stressful, the CO2 level dropped in a certain number of the soldiers, the others it didn't. And there was one man there who was responsible for his team in defusing a bomb, and he blew them all up. His CO2 level dropped like a rock. He became disoriented, didn't know what he was doing. He made a mistake, and they didn't really die, but he messed it up. He blew it. And there's a trigger.
What caused it to drop, though?
Well, you have to look at it's the mechanics where he changed. He started breathing differently compared to the other men around him who didn't. Yeah. They might have been breathing a lot faster, like what will happen when you get stressed. People often start breathing a lot faster, a lot of them. And that doesn't have to produce a CO2 change at all. You can breathe fast, slow. I find lots of people breathing really slowly, say 6 or 8 breaths per minute, who have lost all kinds of CO2. And the next person is at 22, 25 breaths per minute and they have normal CO2 levels. And that's because the size of the breath, the amplitude of the breath, the volume of the breath is reduced. The rate increases, but the rate increases, but the volume decreases, and they maintain normal CO2 levels. And we work with people to change their breathing rate and to maintain the right CO2 level, because we're always changing the rate. Look at me. Look what I'm doing when I'm talking. I'm changing my breathing all over the place. Yeah. I'm using air to make sounds. So that's one of the functions of breathing. It has nothing to do with respiration. It's speaking, communicating, which I'm doing now, but it's coordinated with my respiratory requirements. Just because I'm holding my breath, pushing my breath, breathing faster than breathing slower, I'm breathing through my mouth right now, and all of these different things, and my CO2 level, I can tell you right now, is up here. It's right where it's supposed to be, because I can feel it. I can tell it when it changes. And there are very specific things that change it. I can give you lots of interesting case examples that are really fascinating to show you how this happens. Yeah, I could give you a quick one if you'd like right now.
Yes, please. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, one quick one would be an Olympic athlete a biathlon Olympic athlete back in quite a few years ago, and she had a real problem. She was a friend of mine's, and my friend wanted me to talk to her about her breathing. I was up in Canada and I was visiting her and so on, and then her friend came to the clinic and told me about her breathing issue and said that for the past 2 or 3 years, something like that, she was missing work a lot in doing her physical therapy work, that she was missing 1 or 2 days a week, and it was unpredictable, and she would have to cancel all of her appointments and so on and reschedule them, and she was in private practice as a physical therapist, and she didn't know what to do. And so she sat down and talked to me, and I said, well, tell me more about it, what actually happens and when. And she says, well, this problem just shows up any old time, and I can't get my breath. I feel really very bad air hunger. I can't function, and I'm there all day with it. I said, well, have you seen anyone about it? And she said, well, I've seen a number of medical doctors who can't find anything wrong with me, and so they think it's kind of in my head, that it's a stress issue. And I can't believe that. I don't really believe that. And they've given me medications. I've taken the medications. I said, do the medications help? She said, they do. It makes me feel more relaxed, less stressful, but it doesn't help my breathing. It has no effect on my breathing at all. And I said, well, I've been listening to you, I said, and I noticed that you told me that on the one hand that you don't know when it's going to happen, but on the other hand, you told me you miss a whole day of work. Since she said, well, yeah, I guess you're right. I never really thought about that. It didn't seem very important. I said, well, I think it's important. You missed a whole day. And she said, well, okay, why is that important? And I said, well, let's find out a little bit more. I said, do you wake up in the morning, you find yourself with all these symptoms and you can't function? She said, well, no. I said, well, do you eat breakfast? She said, well, of course. I said, well, I'm just curious because I don't. So I said, okay, so you eat breakfast and you're okay when you're eating breakfast? She said, well, yeah. And I said, well, then you miss a whole day of work, so somehow it must be right after breakfast that you're getting these symptoms. She said, yeah, you're right. Hey, you know what else? The same thing happens to me sometime right after lunch. I said, that's interesting. Seems to happen right after you eat. She said, yes, I never thought of that. 3 years later, in 2 minutes, she's discovered this just by talking to her a little bit about her breathing. I said, now, what do you do all day? Here you are struggling, and what do you do? You're at home, and you can't go to work, and you must do something. She said, well, I try to take control of it. I try to do different things. And I said, well, does any of it work? She said, no. I said, well, what do you do? She said, well, I read up on certain kinds of breathing that I've been practicing, slowing my breathing down, trying to relax, taking larger breaths and all that. I said, does it work at all? She says, no. And not only that, but sometimes I feel a little worse. I don't know what to do. She said, I just don't know what to do. And by the way, that CO2 device you've connected to me and you're monitoring my CO2, I already had my CO2 checked. And I know it's normal. So that's not a problem. And I said, well, we'll see. We'll see. So right now you feel okay. You're getting enough air. She says, yeah, I'm getting enough air. I'm just fine. I said, so what happens during the day? Nothing works. But by dinner, are you still suffering? She says, well, no. I said, well, what do you do at the end of the day? She said, well, I do 2-hour workouts. That's interesting. You can't get your breath all day, and now you go to the gym and you do a strenuous workout, and then you get your breath back. And she said, yeah, I guess so. She said, hey, you know what I'm going to do next time? When I have this problem, I'm going to the gym. I said, yeah, that apparently solves the problem, right? She said, yeah. I said, don't you find that to be a little bit strange? That you're sitting on your couch and you're suffocating, but when you go to the gym and work hard and bust your butt working, that you can get enough air? Doesn't that seem a little strange to you? She said, yeah, that is strange. I don't really understand that. And I said, well, I think it's because you're breathing one way when you're on that couch and you're breathing a different way when you're on the gym. It's a different breathing habit that it kicks in. Can we do a little work together? She said, sure. So she's already hooked up to the CO2 level, the capnometer. We're looking at her CO2, and her CO2 is normal. And so what I do is I coach her into overventilating. And I lower it down to a moderately low level, and I know what all the levels are because I'm looking at the CO2, and I'm very familiar with what's a serious deficit and what's moderate and what's a light deficit. It's very different, the effects you get. And I'm coaching her, and I get her down to what I would call a moderately low level of CO2. And here's what she does. She gets very upset. She goes, oh, this is exactly what happens to me. This is exactly what happens to me, and I'm not going to be able to get out of this the whole day. And I said, well, how did we do this? What was it that we did to bring this about? She said, I did what you told me. I said, I asked you to do what you do during the day to try to feel better. That's what I asked you to do. And she just scratched her head. It was like, my God, you're right. That's really true. That's what I do. I said, okay. I said, what's the solution? She said, well, I just have to stop doing this. And I said, okay, well, why don't you go ahead and stop? She couldn't. She couldn't get out of it. She's trapped in a vicious circle. And she starts to get worse. The CO2 level starts to go down more, and she starts to feel panicky. And I said, look, you can see here on the screen it's getting worse, not better. And she said, yeah, I just don't know what to do. So then I worked with her to coach her. And I coached her into taking very small breaths, as small and as gentle as possible. That works for a lot of people in a crisis situation. So she was doing that, and it took about 5 or 6 minutes, and she's almost to normal. And she says, God, I cannot believe this. I said, what do you mean? She said, I'm hardly breathing. I said, well, you're breathing enough. I said, I know. She said, that's not what I mean. She said, I'm getting all the air I need. I feel fine. I said, well, what have you learned here? She said, well, I take control of the breathing. I try to manipulate it, and it just keeps me in this bad place. I think when I eat, somehow I get unregulated when I'm eating. Because I get in a hurry and I try to eat fast. And I said, well, I think that's probably a good discovery that you've just made. Let's try it again. So I coach her to get down. I said, okay, let's see you get back. She can't do it. She can't do it. I said, well, maybe you could go to the gym and you could do it. And she said, yeah, well, that would work. And I said, well, let me coach you again. I bring her back up. And after the 4th time or so, she was able to get herself back. And after that, she was on her own. And because I was visiting, that was in Canada, I live down here, and it was a long time ago, and we weren't working on the internet. But she was able to overcome the problem doing what we call negative practice, where you go into a hypocapnic state, which is a CO2 deficiency state. It's called hypocapnia. So you're hypo, too little, capnia, carbon dioxide, hypocapnia. She'd go in, practice going in. That's called negative practice. You become an expert at doing the wrong thing. So you're not a victim of it. You own the habit. You overventilate, you're there, you feel everything, you back out of it. You go in, you back out of it. So now it becomes yours, you own it. And if you find yourself doing that in crisis, you know how to get out. But there may be other things operating in that situation that prevent you from that. You're too frightened, you can't focus on using the technique, because there's a lot more to overcoming a habit. That's just an intervention. It's not really overcoming the habit. So she was able to overcome it completely after 2 or 3 years of missing 1 or 2 days of work per week, never had a problem again. So there was a trigger there. It had to do with eating, and she'd get desynchronized, and then she didn't know how to get out of where she ended up, and she didn't realize where she ended up. And then I showed her, I said, look, the person who measured your CO2 level before, who was someone who actually I knew, who had listened to lectures of mine and got a capnometer through me, what that person didn't really understand what she was doing. What she did is she measured the CO2 while, the person I'm talking about right now was sitting in a chair. And of course, that's not a trigger. Just measuring the CO2 when you're sitting in your chair there is not likely to be a trigger. It's when you stand in front of the audience that it's a problem, or you start doing your sport that it's a problem, not when you're just sitting there talking to me. So you don't just measure the CO2 like blood pressure. I take blood pressure and I say, your blood pressure is too high, and then we assume that that's true all the time. That's not the way breathing is. It moves all over the place, and it's regulated by these triggers, as all habits are. Anyway, there's an example.
That's really, you make me think about my dad and the doctor. He has white coat syndrome, so when he gets his blood pressure checked at the doctor's, it's
Exactly.
really high. But when he does it at home on the sofa, anyway.
That's right. Exactly. So, that's correct. That's it.
Yeah. So it's like a reverse of that almost.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. So the author of Breath, James Nestor, and another guy called Anders Olsen, they did a 10-day experiment you might be aware of, where they taped up their nose and they just breathed through their mouth for 10 days. And they measured like a load of stuff. And some of the big headlines I remember from that experiment was blood pressure shot up by about 20 points, snoring went from 4 minutes to 4 hours a night, blood work became pre-diabetic at the end of the 10 days, and they were looking at insulin levels. So just by making that simple mechanical change from nose to mouth, it would seem over this, very small experiment.
You mean from mouth to nose? You meant mouth to nose.
So they blocked up their nose for 10 days.
Oh, they blocked their nose. Okay,
Yeah,
start over again. So I'm sorry, I missed something there.
Yeah, they couldn't breathe through the mouth for 10 days, the nose for 10 days. And then they measured like a load of stuff. And it would seem snoring, like I say, pre-diabetic blood work, blood pressure, sleep quality, irritation was awful. They just had a really terrible 10-day experience.
When they were breathing through their mouth. You mean when they
through their mouth
closed up the nose, they could only breathe through the mouth.
Correct.
It's really going to throw the person off, because what they do normally or automatically it isn't possible for them to do it. If they're a nose breather and you shut off the nose, you're completely disorienting. That behavior, which is normal, now is completely disrupted, and the person may be doing what I was mentioning earlier and trying to take control in what they're doing. You see, making assumptions about carbon dioxide is a very dangerous thing. When you do that kind of thing and you're saying carbon dioxide is changed as a function of this, unless you measure it, you don't know what you're talking about. You've got to measure it. The first thing, I have something here for dummies, for medical dummies, for physicians and nurses who are dummies. It's a joke, they're not dummies, but it's for dummies. It's written by a physician for them about blood gases. And basically it says never to look at the mechanics in essence and assume that you know what the carbon dioxide level is, because you'll be wrong. Now, statistically, you might be right, that there'll be more people, say, who are fast breathing or mouth breathing. There'll be more of them who are over breathing than the people who breathe through the nose. More of them. But this is a correlation, because people who worry about breathing are more likely to breathe through the mouth. People who are concerned about it, about getting enough air, and they're doing everything they can to make sure they have enough air, consciously or unconsciously, are more likely to be overbreathers, because that's their solution to the feelings they have about breathing. So it doesn't, you never want to make an assumption about CO2 levels based on the mechanics. If you're going to guess and you have money and you have to make a bet, then you're going to bet on someone who's a mouth breather that they're going to be more likely to be overbreathing than somebody else. But it's not a cause and effect thing. That doesn't cause it. Why would mouth breathing cause bad CO2 level? From a respiratory reflex perspective, there's no explanation for it. It doesn't regulate on the basis of that. You can keep normal CO2 levels no matter what you're doing with your breathing. You know, you're breathing in your chest, you're breathing in your diaphragm, you're breathing through your mouth, you're breathing through your nose, you're breathing faster, slower, you know, whatever it is. We see it all the time. I'm monitoring CO2 for 40 years. 40 years. We've trained hundreds of people. You know, we have a master's degree program we do. We have all kinds of, we look at all kinds of other physiology in real time. You know, that's not what we're focused on. We don't focus on teaching people the right mechanics, ever. It's about allowing for that fundamental respiration to take place despite the mechanics. The mechanics are important from the perspective that the reflexes can operate, that you don't get in the way of the reflexes unless there's a good reason. And the good reason could be something like, I'm going to dive into the water and swim the length of the swimming pool underwater. You know, I want to control it. Or I'm doing holotropic breathing and I want to overventilate on purpose. I want to lower my CO2 because as a consequence, there may be triggering of memories and triggering of different kinds of experiences while I'm working with you. So I deliberately have you lower your level. But what's interesting about that, though that happens for a lot of people, when you have them overventilate on purpose, where you lose CO2 because you get what's called disinhibition, okay, when you do that. It's a neurophysiological phenomenon, disinhibition. So you get a discharge of emotion when you do that. And if you're anxious before you do that, then it's going to exacerbate that anxiety. It'll exacerbate whatever emotions are already been discharged. They'll be made that much worse when you overventilate, or it may trigger emotions that otherwise wouldn't have come out, like anger. And so what you find, a lot of people, they learn to overventilate and to get rid of CO2 so they can get angry. Because one case in point was a woman who controlled her husband in her environment by getting angry. And the way she could get angry, she was frightened. But the way she would get angry is by overventilating and losing CO2. And she'd get an anger discharge and she'd just take over, just like that. I've had that's a pretty common thing where people can trigger emotions by essentially overventilating. But what's interesting is a lot of people overventilate. It doesn't produce memories and all that kind of stuff. Rather, what it does is it helps them escape memories and to escape emotions, because when they overventilate, they dissociate and disconnect. They disconnect from the people around them. They disconnect from everything around them. Like a little kid I was working with from Japan, flew all the way to the U.S. to work with me with his father for the weekend. Wow. And we were working with this little kid, and we had a translator there, and I was talking to the kid's father through the translator, and I noticed that the little kid CO2 levels suddenly dropped. It was normal and it just dropped. So I asked the translator, could you please ask the child what he's doing? And the child said, this is what I do at school. I said, could you ask him why he does that at school? He says, yes, I don't like my teacher. So I said, well, what is it about the teacher? The teacher makes me feel bad. And that the kid would overventilate to disconnect from the environment. And then I found out he did that with his father too. The same thing, that he had learned that as a way of consciously to disconnect. So my partner Sandra worked with a little boy, with a translator, talking to him about how this wasn't a very good idea, because it could become a habit that he would be unaware of, that when he was older, whenever he would encounter a stressful kind of a situation, that he would, by metaphor, that would generalize. This is basic behavioral science, where you get generalization of the behavior, and now the kid might then breathe that way whenever they encounter a situation where they don't want to be a part of it. They disconnect themselves from it. And we find that a lot, like in trauma, where people will overventilate. When they do that, they can disconnect from things that are hard for them. Because when you do that, you create a state change in the brain. It's called state-dependent learning. And that's where I came from. I came from behavioral pharmacology, where drugs create a state change, and then they learn a new personality in that state. And then they can access the personality by going into that state. They take the drug. So the reason that addiction is so powerful is because they're accessing a new personality. And that's what really holds the person in that addiction phenomenon. And breathing can do the same thing, because you can create state changes. And those state changes serve you. So in holotropic breathing, for example, you get a state change, and then you can, not only are you getting disinhibition of emotion, but then with that state change, other kinds of things happen, because your sense of self is, you have a different sense of self associated with different states of mind. So in one state, I feel, I'm not confident. I'm not feeling good about myself. But in another state, I feel really great, and I'm humorous and laughing all the time. But in this other state, I can't access that. So this is a huge literature in psychology, state-dependent learning, and in animals. In animals and humans, state-dependent learning is a very powerful phenomenon. And so breath controls states. And so you can access these different behaviors or personalities, in a sense, by changing the breathing, you see, and at the expense of compromising respiration, often.
Okay.
Anyway, I've said probably too much.
No, please. This is fantastic. So let me ask you this. So when it comes to purposely choosing overventilation, like a holotropic or fill in the blank, a conscious connected breathing technique, what is the most efficient way to overventilate and blow off CO2?
Well, first of all, I'll say something I think is important. I think that every breath worker, no matter who they are, no matter what they are doing, should know about respiration. They're experts at breathing, but they're novices on the subject of respiration. You need to know the basics of respiration and what it's about. So if I were doing some of those kinds of breathing, or say holotropic, what I would do, first of all, I have someone, let's say it's you. I mean, there's a number of yous, maybe there's 10 people. You may already be hypocapnic.
Yeah.
You may not be. And if I don't have a device to measure it, and I have everyone do a particular procedure to lower it, some of them will not go down. Their CO2 levels are not going to change. I see that all the time. I coach someone to overbreathe, and they don't do it. They can't do it. They try and can't do it. And they have an overbreathing problem. They actually do have a trigger for low CO2 level, but they can't even do it when you ask them to do it. They have to take deeper breaths and all that, and they can't do it. I actually have to model it and say, follow me, because I can get dizzy in 2 breaths. My CO2 level will go down. And they have to model me. So just because you give them instructions in holotropic breathing doesn't mean they're all going to be overventilating. Some of them won't be at all. Others will be a little bit, some of them a lot, some of them extremely. Some of them may be actually fainting and feeling like they're going to vomit. Tremendous variability in terms of what you're actually going to get. So you're just assuming the person's level is going down, and it may not, and you have no idea how far it's going down. And then you leave them down there. What steps do you take to get them back? They might get trapped, like that athlete I was talking to you about. They get trapped and they leave there trapped. Is that what you want? So you take a device, you can measure, like this little capnometer, one of the things I do is I own this company, Better Physiology. It's about 24 years old. And so what I would do is I would measure this with you and see that you're having trouble getting down, and then help you get it down, and then bring you down to a level that works for you. Not bring you way down to an extreme where you might have a panic attack. Bring you down to a certain level where you say, yeah, I can feel that, and I can see what level you're at, and assign you that level. And then later on, as I'm working with you in holotropic breathing, I can then assign a lower level and work with you at lower levels, and then show you how to get back. And so you can learn to feel it so that you know when you're going down. You can feel the symptoms. You don't need a device. You can feel it when you go down. You know how to get back. And then if you do holotropic work, you know what level you're bringing yourself down to. And it's a responsible thing to do. You know what you're doing. And you have to take into consideration that when you lower CO2 levels, you could have a heart attack, you could have an angina attack, you could have an epileptic seizure, you can get all kinds of symptoms associated with other kinds of conditions that that person may be dealing with. Maybe they have a panic attack problem. You need to be aware of those things. You should know that when you do that. And you really want to be sure that person can get back to a normal level. It means measuring it. It's not about making any assumptions. It's extremely important. So you can use that, that knowledge that person can learn about themselves in that process, because they may be doing that at other times, and they may be holotropic at other times and places in their life without realizing that's what they're doing.
Sure.
You know,
If I wanted to dump the CO2, again, just play with me on this. Because
Sure.
I've been in all sorts of breathwork classes where they've done, a conscious connected nasal breath and a conscious connected mouth breath. And typically, people will report nasal faster breathing tends to be a more softer, gentle experience. But if I'm going hell for leather with the mouth, it tends to be that people have a stronger experience. And these are not scientific terms. I'm just giving you some
Well, what we
feedback here.
do is, we do a whole induction on overbreathing, because we do testing of all kinds, where we reproduce the symptoms that they experience. Because most people, and this is important to understand, most people have CO2 problems. They're not chronically low CO2 levels. Like in Buteco, the idea is to build up a tolerance for higher levels of CO2. This is just not an issue for most people with CO2 problems. It's just not an issue at all. Because the problems are acute. The problems that, like say in New York City, where 60% of the ambulance runs are supposedly because of overventilating and losing CO2. These people with the symptoms they're getting their symptoms because they're overventilating, because normally their CO2 levels are normal.
Yeah.
They're already adjusted to the right level. Their symptoms are coming on because now, at this particular moment, because of a habit that triggered them to their overbreathing, the CO2 level drops and they get these radical symptoms. And then if I am with that person, I can in a few minutes get them back to normal. Okay, and all the symptoms go away. So we do that all the time. We have a person overventilate, they get the symptoms, they go, oh my God, this is what happens to me. And then they can't get back, and they understand they get trapped, and so on. It has nothing to do with building up a tolerance for CO2, nothing. None of those people who are calling 911 is because they have a low level of CO2 that they have to now build up a tolerance to a higher level. That's not true for any of them. It's people with chronic hypocapnia, chronically low levels of CO2, then tolerance is an issue, but we don't call it tolerance. It's not a question of tolerance. It's a question of what you like. It's not like you end up tolerating the right level. You end up loving the right level. You appreciate being at the right level. It's not like I can tolerate this. You don't like being low. You like being at the right level. It's not tolerance. It's learning a preference. And in psychology and physiology, we don't talk about set points. What we talk about is a physiological phenomenon called habituation. And you habituate. It's about sensory systems, and you're detecting what's going on in your environment, like a novel stimulus. Like you hear a loud noise and it disturbs you, and after a while you don't even notice it. It becomes part of the environment. Habituation is fundamental to being able to learn anything. Like you go into a room where someone's baking bread, and they don't smell it, but you go in there and say, oh my God, this bread smells fantastic. 5 minutes later, you can't even smell it. That's habituation. And it's fundamental to being able to the attentional process. You're in a bar. You and I are having a beer. We're talking together. And I screen out everything around me so I can hear you and what you're saying. This is about habituation. And CO2 is no exception. It's a phenomenon connected with habituation. So you habituate to a lower level. So now you have to habituate to another level. And that's where you're comfortable, is at that habituation level. The system titrates, and you end up liking, that's the psychology of it, that you like being at the right level. You don't tolerate it.
Gotcha. So in the potato world, then there's a lot of cupping, feather breathing, slow, light, gentle breathing. You'll do a control pause test at the start, and it might be like 5 seconds for the impulse to breathe. You go back and check it. 90 days later, it's 35 seconds. The chemoreceptor stuff hasn't changed. It's more they've just got used to feeling.
Well, no, if it's chronic, then you have habituation at a lower level, where they then, by exposing themselves to it and practicing raising it, then they can habituate to a higher level. But what's really to understand is, why does a person have a low CO2 level in the first place? There's a habit that they have learned, where the trigger for the habit is, rather than this being an external event, like, say, focusing on an audience that you have to speak to, or running a race, or whatever it is you're doing, that it's an internal stimulus. I've worked with a lot of Buteyko workers with serious overbreathing problems, with serious CO2 problems, a lot of them. And they've been shocked, where they were thinking somehow that, they're an expert with the CO2 level, they have really great controlled pauses and all that, but they have very low CO2 levels.
Wow.
And their assumption has been that they don't have a CO2 problem, they've just been dead wrong. Because there's a habit that's gotten you down there, and if you don't address the habit, it doesn't go away. It doesn't matter what you practice. If it doesn't address the habit, it doesn't go away. You have to look at the specifics of the habit. Where was it learned? What are the triggers for it? What is motivating the behavior? What is the payoff? Every habit has a payoff that sustains it. There's an outcome that sustains the habit. You got to address the outcome. And then the motivation behind the habit. You have to address it. Give you a good example, a real simple one, where people who abort the breath. They breathe out, and then they abort it. Well, one thing you can do with a CO2 device, when you're tracking CO2 as a person breathes, when they breathe in, the CO2 reads 0, because it's measuring carbon dioxide concentration in the room, or close to 0. And then when you breathe out, it goes up to a level equivalent to about 5% of the total gas is carbon dioxide. So you see this curve. Now you're looking at airflow. So you can see when the person aborts the breath without going into it, just like that. You can see when the person aborts the breath. And they're aborting, that means they're somehow taking control. It's not the respiratory system. The respiratory system isn't aborting the breath. You are. You've learned to do it. It's nothing to do with respiration. What has it got to do with respiration? Nothing. All right? You've learned to do it.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? That means you're taking control, right? It's not the reflex. It's you. And it's you like you're unconscious. But who is your unconscious? It's the consciousness of your body. The body isn't unconscious. You're just unconscious of what it's doing. And when you try to explain what it's doing by referring to the body, you call it your unconscious. But for me, that's the awareness that's contained in the body itself. And when you work with people, you help them form a partnership with their body, so they can see what their body has learned, so that they can then help their body unlearn it. That's an important piece of what we do. So now, in this particular case, the person's aborting the breath, and here's what I've done hundreds and hundreds of times. Endless demonstrations. I have the person sit back, and I want them to focus on their exhale, and I want them to think of the exhale as something their friend is doing. Their friend is their body. I want you to notice what your body does. It's not about what you do or want to do. It's about what does your body do if you get out of the way. What does it do? So you step out of the way and you're focusing. And one of the things I'll ask you to notice is whether, the breath ends, whether there's a transition time at the end of the breath. Do you push the breath? What kind of emotions do you have? Do you feel any anxiety, any fear, air hunger? What do you experience without going through the whole thing? And so what person may find is that when the exhale takes place, if they get near the end of the exhale, they have a little anxiety, a trace, because they're allowing it. They've gotten out of the way. A lot of people can't even do it, but they get out of the way. And they notice if it goes out and it gets near the end of it, they get air hunger and they have a trace of anxiety. And they never noticed it. They never noticed it before. And when they don't allow it, and it aborts, they avoid that anxiety and that air hunger. The motivation here behind it all is the fear and the air hunger that is contained in that exhale, near the end of the exhale. We call this classical conditioning in behavioral science or in psychology, classical conditioning. So you get air hunger, you get anxiety that occurs there, and they avoid that by aborting the breath. And what is the outcome that sustains it? The outcome of it all is that they can reduce or eliminate the fear, eliminate the air hunger. So they keep doing it their whole life. They just keep doing it, and they find that they're amazed. They've been doing it most of their life, maybe, and they found that, and they're amazed by it. Okay, so if you teach someone slow breathing, for example, and people where that's true, what you end up doing is exposing that person to that end of the exhale and that transition time, a little bit of a transition time. You end up exposing them to that, and you get what's called extinction. It's desensitization training. It has nothing to do with being a slow breath. It has to do with desensitization. It has to do with the psychology of it, not the slowness of it. The slowness allows the person to learn. It allows the body to learn, it's like a phobia. You don't get over a phobia by learning that what you're afraid of is harmless. It doesn't go away. That phobia, you still run from the thing that bothers you, no matter what you were taught. You've got to expose yourself to the thing that's troubling to you. You have to ride the elevator to get over your fear of the elevators. You have to expose yourself to get rid of that physiological learning that has taken place. And so you slow breathing, that's what you're accomplishing, but the person who's working with a person doing some kind of breathing work is assuming somehow it's the slowness of it that's important. It's the psychology of it that's important. You get desensitization. It's a physiological thing. You get desensitization, and air hunger also, along with fear, dissipates. And then you end up waiting long enough in that interval. There's a reflex in there. If you focus on it, you'll find a reflex in that exhale. And when the person finds that reflex, they feel confident. They build trust in their system, and they can step away from it. They're not worried about it. They step away from it because they know that reflex is operating. They can feel it. Okay? And so when they find that, because of the slowness, they set the stage for what? Learning. They set the stage for learning. It's not about breathe slow because it's good, and breathe fast because don't breathe fast because it's bad. It's about setting the stage so that that physiological learning can take place. Fast breathing, I'll give you another example. A lot of people think fast breathing is not good. You breathe fast with your running, but in general, fast breathing is not a good thing. And a lot of people, when they breathe fast, you see they're frightened. And a lot of people interpret that as they'll say, you see, when you breathe fast, that's sympathetic. That's the sympathetic nervous system that you're triggering there, and that's why you're anxious. My answer to that is I roll my eyes in my head, like, you got to be kidding. That's a complete nonsense. There may be the sympathetic nervous system operating, but who cares? What's that got to do with anything? I'm sympathetic right now. And am I frightened or is it negative? I'm excited. I'm glad to meet you. We're talking. I'm extremely sympathetic. I love it. So sympathetic can be negative. It can be positive, just like parasympathetic can be negative or positive. Parasympathetic, you're depressed. Parasympathetic, you're relaxed. Sympathetic, you can be terrified, or you can be turned on by everything around you. So in the sympathetic, when I move my muscles, I get more sympathetic than if I move them slowly. Does that mean I should be walking around like this all the time, or what? So when you look at fast breathing, what you do is that breathing is an experience. So when you breathe fast, you experience it. And it will trigger learned behaviors, the experience of it. And one of them are emotions. Not because breathing triggers the sympathetic nervous system, but because breathing may produce fear in you because of a bad experience you had. It's like a phobia. Now whenever you feel that, and when you breathe fast, a lot of people reach into the chest too. So now they feel their chest, and they're breathing fast, and they feel claustrophobic now because they're breathing in their chest maybe. And so now you get this fear associated with it, which doesn't have anything to do with the sympathetic nervous system. It has to do with what was learned. So if I have someone like that, what I do is I teach them to breathe fast. Say, let's work on fast breathing together so you can be really comfortable with it. Because you know what I noticed in you, John? I noticed that your CO2 levels were really great. Your respiration was good. You were frightened, but your respiration is good. And that's what you want when you're frightened, is that the respiration, the breathing has changed, but the respiration is good. Just like the British Navy. Those people are frightened. They're challenged, but they don't have to be hypocapnic. They can have good CO2 levels so they can function when they're highly sympathetic and, in fact, frightened. Okay? So now, in this particular case, I would train you to breathe fast and be comfortable. So you would desensitize. We use desensitization techniques that are used in behavior therapy and psychology. Our techniques, we borrow all the techniques that are used in behavior therapy. Those are learning techniques. And those learning techniques we use with behaviors at large, in this case, breathing behavior. So we use all those techniques to address the issue of breathing behavior. What do you do with your breathing? Like, say, using your arms. Some people use their arms in constructive ways all the time, and some people use them in very destructive ways at certain times. They're violent. So they know how to use their arms. That's not a question. It's what they use it for. So they do great things 98% of the time, but 2% of the time they're violent. They're using their arms depending on how they're motivated. It's the same way with breathing. It's motivated. And there are outcomes associated with it. And it weaves its way into everything in a person's life. And that's what we do. We do what's called a breathing behavior analysis to discover how you're breathing, how it's affecting you, what are the triggers for it, when do you breathe this way or that way in different situations, so that you can optimize respiration regardless of the mechanics, regardless of the music that the mechanics are playing. Yeah. The chemical axis needs to be stable and in the right zone, so that respiration is good despite the mechanics.
Okay, talking mechanics then, so how important is vital capacity when it comes to respiration, a person's well-being, and things like rib cage flexibility, the ability to move one's diaphragm?
Well, these things are for people who have been compromised somewhere along the line. For the average person, it's irrelevant. Those things are all within normal ranges, and it's irrelevant because the breathing that we do, the amount of air we need for every liter of blood you move through the lungs. You and I can move at least 20 liters of air. And you only need 1 liter of air. So the amount of air that you need to move through the system is very small. And what you can see often, I give you case after case of people who've been through surgery unnecessarily because of the assumptions that get made about the anatomy of the situation, like say an airway that's narrow. So you go through surgery because you have air hunger and you have breathing issues, that they find a narrow airway, so they assume that somehow it's the narrow airway that might be responsible for these symptoms, and you go through surgery and there's no positive outcome because it didn't have anything to do with the narrow airway. the symptoms were triggered by other kinds of habits that that person had learned. I can give you case after case of people who didn't go to surgery because it was discovered that it was a breathing problem that would be triggered at certain times and places. People learn these habits, say, when they've been injured, for example. So one particular person I remember that she was injured, had a serious automobile accident, and now, she had this back issue, and she was going to go in for surgery on her neck and back, and the surgeon was certain that this could help her, but the surgeon referred her to a close friend of mine who owns 5 physical therapy clinics. I have an interview that you can listen to if you're interested. And she did an analysis of movement where she would lean back, and you get the narrowing of the joints in the back and all these different things, and found that the whole phenomenon, the pain phenomenon, was regulated by a dysfunctional breathing habit. All of it. 100% of it. Had nothing to do with the injury. But it's because of the injury that she learned the habit. So she addressed the habit. Woman never went for surgery, although the woman was very skeptical about working on the habit. And my friend said, you'd rather go for surgery? You want surgery on your back, which could be dangerous? You want to do that before you check out whether it's a habit or not, because you just saw how you could create all the symptoms by overventilating a little bit, and how they all went away associated with the movements that you used to do, the movements that you actually do that brings on these symptoms. And so when you do the movement, you overventilate. You don't want to address it? And she said, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Went through a little bit of training, overcame the problem completely, still had her injury, but she didn't have those symptoms that were associated with that hypocapnia.
Okay.
So it plays a role in these things. It interacts with these things.
Yeah.
And so it's not like everything's caused by it. It interacts. If you have epilepsy and at times of stress you start to overventilate, you may have an epileptic seizure because you change the threshold for the seizure. Because you create an oxygen deficit in the brain, you create a glucose deficit, and that potentiates the seizure. So then you don't want to breathe that way because you may have a lot more seizures than you would otherwise have to have.
Yeah.
Again, habits are what bring that on. It's not a question of your breathing is bad, so we're going to teach you to be a good breather. There's nothing to do with that. It's not like that. It's like you're a good breather most of the time, but sometimes you're not, and it's regulated by very specific inputs. And if you don't address those things, you're not likely to get far unless you address them by accident, like slow breathing addresses a lot of things by accident.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about external CO2. So I've got my door closed right now, and my room, from a sound perspective, we've jumped up to around 2,000 at the moment on our little CO2 monitor. How much of a problem is indoor CO2 levels for well-being, respiration?
Well, it's likely to be very helpful.
Helpful or
But yes,
okay.
yes.
Okay.
Helpful to the people who are overventilators. It's like a paper bag. Your room is a paper bag. But the percent is so small, it doesn't virtually have any effect anyway. You might have 1% or 0.5% CO2 in the room right now. Very low. I have seen it as high as 2 or 3 millimeters. I remember once I was giving a workshop in Munich, Germany, and there were about 40 people in a small room in the winter with all the doors closed. And it was like 2 or 3 millimeters. So it was like a little paper bag effect. But normally in a paper bag, you'll see 7 or 8 millimeters. I remember one time I went to a ski resort, and I was waiting in line at the hotel, front desk, and there was someone in front of me, and the man in front of me was complaining about altitude illness because the elevation there was about 9,000 feet or something like that. And the hotel clerk said, get a paper bag. So you see the altitude illness, what did it have to do with? Not with the oxygen. The altitude illness was because of the CO2, his overbreathing and losing the CO2. So by breathing in a paper bag, you're going to have less oxygen and get a lot more carbon dioxide, and then that restored, theoretically, restores a lot of people to normal. So what a lot of people do when they get to altitude is they start taking larger breaths because they have a sense of air hunger because of the low CO2, of the low O2. Even though the O2, the hemoglobin saturation is almost the same, they still experience a little bit of air hunger, and so they may take over, with a habit they have, take over the breath and lose carbon dioxide and get altitude illness. But going back to what you're talking about there, CO2 is a very healthy, precious substance that you want and need. Well, who cares whether there's whatever that is? So what? I mean, that's great. Because if you put say you and I are at 5%, let's say, and we measure it in millimeters of mercury. We're at 5%. We go into a room that's got 1%. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I wasn't talking about 1%. I was talking about 1 millimeter, which is extremely small, a percent. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you and I are at 5%. We go to a room it's like a paper bag, and there's 1% in there. What is our body going to do? We're just going to ventilate a little bit. The reflexes in your body are going to cause you to breathe a tiny bit faster, or maybe take a slightly deeper breath and ventilate it off. It's going to maintain the concentration in your blood that you need just by breathing a little faster, a little slower, automatically. You don't have to do anything. Mm-hmm. So if you have a little bit more carbon dioxide in that room, so what? All you're going to do, let's say it was significant, which it isn't. Let's say it is significant. Your body will adjust to it immediately. It'll simply ventilate off more carbon dioxide to maintain the correct level in the blood and in the other extracellular fluids at all times. That's what it does. That's its job. If there's too much carbon dioxide, you're under breathing in essence, then the respiratory drive centers will immediately ventilate more of it off. You don't have to do anything.
Interesting. So you wouldn't be worried about, though. I mean, I don't know what that is at the conversion to the percentage you're talking about, but you wouldn't be worried about it being at 2,000 or 3,000 when it's normally around 400 outside. That's not a problem for you for like sleeping. So
no,
for a short,
no. Why would I worry about that? Why? For what?
There was a study James Nestor made famous on a big podcast where they tested school children at 400. And then they tested them at 1,500, and at 1,500, scores dropped significantly, and they were saying that their brain function was impaired.
Well, I'll tell you, it doesn't have anything to do with carbon dioxide. Okay. I mean, why would it? I mean, there isn't a single physiological reason for it. Nothing. It's nonsense. Honestly.
Interesting. So from your perspective then, if you're sitting in a room at sort of 3,000 for 8 hours while you're sleeping...
I don't really use those units. I use millimeters of mercury, or I use percent. And, in the atmosphere, the percent of carbon dioxide is so tiny that a capnometer can't even measure it.
Okay.
I can't even, with this instrument right here, I couldn't even measure it.
Interesting.
This is what's used in medicine. No one would give a damn. And if it were, 5 times that, it's so small. It's just utterly irrelevant.
Okay.
Utterly irrelevant.
That's fascinating. So from your perspective, there'd be no reason for cognition to drop, for brain fog to increase if you're in a room and the CO2's increased.
What? The higher the CO2 level, the better, up to the point of underventilating, up to much higher level. Like normal, when you talk about, so give you a perspective, in the millimeters of mercury. Let me just give you a quick little perspective. When you talk about atmospheric pressure, you're looking at 760 millimeters of total pressure in the atmosphere at sea level. Okay? And 159, that total pressure, 760 millimeters, 159 of that is oxygen. And that's about 20.92% or something. 20.92% of 760, is 159. So there's 159, we call it partial pressure. Oxygen, partial pressure, 159. Nitrogen, 600 and something. I don't remember exactly what it is. Argon is the fourth most common gas. Then you have, after that, you have CO2. You know what CO2 is? 0.3 millimeters out of the 760. Okay? 5% is 38 millimeters. The normal range of CO2 that you want in the blood, the arterial level, is between 35 and 45. That's normal. Most people struggle to get much above 37 or 38. If you get up to 44, the evidence shows it's going to improve performance. Interesting studies about raising the CO2 level improves performance because you get better blood flow in the brain. You get much more vasodilation in the brain as a result. When you go too far, then you're under breathing. But you get up in the low 40s, and this is ideal. Like the name Joe Mercola, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I saw your podcast
Well, I did.
with him.
Yeah, I did an interview with Joe, and he bought a capnometer actually, and from us, and he changed everything he was doing in his exercise program. Totally modified it, and went to work on his own breathing for about a month, and brought his CO2 levels up during exercise up into the low 40s, and he was finished. Did an amazing job. Whereas before, when he did exercise, his CO2 levels were way down, down around 25. That's low against 35. Worked himself up to 41, 42, and completely changed his regimen, totally changed his opinion of what it's about. And just to give you an idea of the work we do, Joe, for example, says that what we do in our work should be taught in every medical school in the world. It should be fundamental to physicians learning about this behavioral approach and understanding physiology at large. It's not just breathing. So that's really my field. My field is not breathing. I'm a psychologist and a physiologist, a combination of the two. And my interest is in looking at physiology as a learning system. That what's really amazing about physiology is that it learns, that it reprograms itself, that it reconfigures itself, and it saves these reconfigurations to use at the right time in the right place. And those reconfigurations are called habits that regulate physiology at large, like hunger, food hunger. Hunger, if you really want to, that's where I came from on my original work. That hunger and blood sugar regulation is a psychophysiological phenomenon, and that it's programmable. It was built that way, so it could be programmed to meet the requirements of an organism and its environment. It'd be like looking at a computer. If you were a doctor, a computer doctor, and you looked at your computer, and all you were interested in were the microprocessors. You didn't even know it had software. You didn't know it had an operating system. You just work on the microprocessors. And now I have an accounting problem, and I come to you as a computer doctor, and you try to work on my microprocessors. You don't even know there's an accounting package in there. You don't even know how it's been programmed or what I've put in it, the numbers I've put in it. You don't know anything about it at all. And you're going to try to fix everything by going to the microprocessors. I mean, what is a computer about? It's about information processing. That's what it does. It's about software. Otherwise, it has no point.
Yeah.
That's its behavior. It processes data. That's what we do. We process data. We collect it. We save it. We remember it. We use it. That's what our system does. So you're talking about breathing, this mechanical, you're going to do this kind of mechanic and that kind of mechanic, and it's like you're working on the microprocessors. You're not addressing the programming. And when you have a good outcome, you assume somehow that one thing causes another, like mouth breathing causes overbreathing. You're not looking at the programming that's embedded in it.
Yeah.
I have a whole analysis, by the way, of the Buteyko technique, a behavioral analysis that will be coming out there's a medical book coming out, Elsevier. It's airway medicine. I have a whole chapter that I was asked to write on how to look at, breathing as a behavior and look at the psychology, or that is the programmability of the physiology. It's really about programming physiology, because medical people don't tend to like words like learning, but they're more content with words like programming. They'll accept that. Sure, programming, learning. We think of the classroom.
Reading that. So could you walk us through a little bit about what happens when we breathe in CO2 at a higher level? Because I've not been able to get a clear answer on this. So, and the reason I'm asking is there's one of the well-known names out there, Anders Olsen, who's a big CO2 guy. He's republished a load of CO2 books. He has a CO2 suit, but one of the things that he's got is a CO2 inhaler, and he can go, again, I'm using slightly different calculations, but you can go up to about 8,000, I believe, on this inhaler. So we can talk about what that may or may not do, but what I'm curious to know from you is, when I breathe in a larger amount of CO2, and that goes into my lungs, am I absorbing that into my body and into my blood? Because my understanding is when we take that breath in, the oxygen's transferring across and jumping on the hemoglobin, and you'll be able to...
There's no easy answer to that. But one thing I would like to say is that one of the things that disturbs me, is that breathing is used just as an intervention by so many people, that it's always an intervention. And this CO2 thing you're talking to me just reminds me of how, breathing, we're going to use breathing to relax. We're going to use breathing to explore memories. We're going to use breathing to do this. We're going to give you CO2 for that. We're going to give you less oxygen for this, and, all these different things that people do with it. But almost nobody looks at breathing as something we do in our lives. They focus on it as a technique. And so the CO2 thing that you're talking about is interesting, but my question is about it, and I'll get to your answer to your question in a minute, is that what I'm interested is what is the objective of doing that? I can see that if you have just had an accident or something serious, you need to get O2 and they give you an oxygen mask, but you don't wear it beyond the moment that you needed it, and they put it on and you had to have oxygen. You had a heart attack, they may make sure you get oxygen immediately, whatever it is. These are interventions. So the CO2 is somehow an intervention in what you're talking about. And it depends on what the concentration is of that CO2. CO2 creates air hunger immediately. So if you breathe in CO2, you will experience air hunger because it plays a major role in that phenomenon. Now, air hunger in general in life is a learned thing. There's no oxygen issue, there's no CO2 issue, but you get air hunger. It's something that gets learned, just like fear is. When you're born, you're not afraid of most things. You learn to be afraid of all these different things. So you get air hunger as a learned phenomenon associated with claustrophobia, for example. You feel claustrophobic. Mm-hmm. But CO2 by itself is a real stimulant of air hunger in any kind of significant quantity. So in this work you're talking about, it's a question of how much CO2 is involved in this. Is it a paper bag level? Is it like, again, thinking of millimeters, 5% is what you want in your blood, which is 38 millimeters, is the ideal magic number, 38 to 42. So when you administer, how much CO2 are you administering? That is, when I breathe it, what's the baseline of it? Is it 6 millimeters? Is it 8 millimeters? Is it 38 millimeters? What is it? And that's going to determine a lot of what you would predict would happen. So I don't know that. When you just tell me someone is going to breathe in some CO2, my question is how much? How is it being regulated?
Yeah.
How is it being regulated? Is it air that has a certain percent of CO2 in it, Or is it
Yeah.
pure CO2 or what?
No, it's connected to a CO2 tank, and I believe it can go again. It goes up to about 8,000 is the I think the
Again, I
max end
don't
of
think in
this.
those terms.
Yeah,
What did you say was in the atmosphere?
400.
Okay, so if you divide 400 into 8,000,
Let's do the.
what does that give you?
Let's have a look. Let's go into this 1 second. Because the thing I was going to ask you, just while I'm pulling this up, there's the story of the lady that had problems with memory in her brain, and she took a 30% CO2 breath. So 30% of the bag of air they inhale was, and it caused a huge panic. And I was always curious
Of
to know,
course.
is the CO2, as soon as it hits the lungs, something in the lungs is detecting the high CO2, or is that immediately getting into the system, and then is it the chemoreceptors or something else? What's being triggered by the external CO2 coming in? What's being triggered in the body to cause a problem? Where's that being felt? Do you know?
But by the way, that 8,000 you're talking about is equivalent to about 6 millimeters. It's about like a paper bag.
Okay.
Okay, so now this, if you're using that kind of CO2 level, if you let the reflexes operate, it'll just accommodate it and maintain a normal level of CO2 in the blood. So whether when you're doing exercise, for example, you generate a huge amount of CO2, but you maintain the same concentration in the alveoli. It doesn't change. You just ventilate off more carbon dioxide to keep the concentration the same at all times. Okay, so now going to your question about the large amount of CO2, 30%, that's huge. That's going to get very quickly right to the brain. You got to have receptor sites that are going to respond to it. And there are in the blood itself, in the receptor sites in the aorta, for example. Within a fraction of a second, as long as it takes blood to get to those receptor sites in the aorta, then there's going to be a message via the autonomic nervous system directly to the receptor sites in the brainstem. So you're going to get an instant kind of air hunger very quickly. As long as it takes time for the blood in the lungs to get to the aorta, and as long as it takes that information to be transmitted from those receptor sites to that brainstem location, that's how long it's going to take.
Yeah. Okay.
Very
So
short time.
this is going to be probably a very frustratingly simple question to ask you, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. So my understanding is, as the blood moves around the body and it comes back to the lungs, CO2 can jump off and get out. But if we're breathing in CO2, does CO2 also jump back on the hemoglobin as it moves around the body, or is it getting in a
The
different
CO2
way?
doesn't jump on the hemoglobin. The CO2 is dissolved in the blood, in the
Right.
plasma, Now, it
Okay.
does
So it's
go
not
into the
being.
red blood cell, but that's trivial. I mean, the fact that CO2 goes in the red blood cell is what obliges the hemoglobin to drop its oxygen. One of the factors. I mean, when blood travels through the system and it gets to a tissue, the low partial pressure oxygen, because the partial pressure oxygen is very low, that obliges the hemoglobin to drop its oxygen. And the higher level of CO2 in the red blood cell and the movement of the pH in an upward direction, the Bohr effect, also causes the hemoglobin to drop the oxygen. Now, if you overventilate and you lose CO2, despite the fact that the O2 concentration is really down when you go into those tissues, because the CO2 level is so low and the pH is so high, it won't readily release or distribute the oxygen, even though the O2 concentration is low. And that's a Bohr effect again. So the hemoglobin will retain it when it should be delivering it. At the same time, you get vasoconstriction because of the effect of the low CO2 level on nitric oxide production. So you get vasoconstriction, hemoglobin doesn't deliver normally, and so on. So the CO2 in the red blood cell is important because of that, but it's in the plasma, that's what we're talking about. When we say, what is the partial pressure arterial CO2 concentration, we're looking at the plasma, not in the red blood cell. We're not looking at hemoglobin in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. My last question for you, because I don't know how we've done 90 minutes or more, 95 minutes. So this is just an interesting phenomenon, the idea of a CO2 bath. And so I've seen things where people are putting their face in carbonated water. I've seen this wonderful presentation actually, where people with diabetes and where they've got like a gangrene foot and they have CO2 baths. What you'll see is over a period of time.
I've been to one of those hospitals. There was a hospital in
Okay,
Austria.
yeah. What's
They
going
had
on with that?
they had mud baths there, and they
Okay.
had carbon dioxide baths. It was very interesting. I don't understand it. I don't know how carbon dioxide, what the hypothesis is. Can't answer your question. Do you know what the hypothesis is?
My understanding was it was bringing nutrients to the surface through some sort of vasodilation.
Right. I don't know how carbon dioxide on the skin would do that. Is it getting through the skin to where does it get to? And if it gets to somewhere, what does it do at that somewhere location? Why would it do something? That's what I would ask, because I'd be interested in knowing. Because I don't know.
I would love to connect you with Anders because he's the guy that's got the CO2 suits. So he inflates you in this big balloon and he has pressurized CO2 come into the body. And he talks a lot about how back in, I'm not sure when this was, 100 years ago, they were using CO2 therapies a lot more for people when they were being like picked up by ambulances or.
By the way, this was a diabetes hospital, rheumatism and diabetes hospital,
Right. Okay.
health center that I
Yeah.
saw these carbon dioxide baths.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. It's covered by insurance. But and there were insurance people there listening to some presentations that a group of us were making. And we asked the insurance company, how is it you pay for these carbon dioxide baths and the mud baths? Is there evidence showing that these things work? I asked this guy. He said, no, there isn't any evidence that we know of, but the public expects it. I said, so you're covering it because the public expects it? He said, yes. This is tradition. It's been around forever. We don't have any choice. It's covered.
That's really fascinating. Dr. Litchfield, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to cover?
Well, I could say that I am inviting the breathwork community to, really learn something more about respiration, because it's a very, very important piece of what they're about, realizing it or not. And at the Professional School of Behavioral Health Sciences, we have all these different programs. We have one in CAPNO Learning, which is about CO2 learning. It's a certification program we have that's a brand new program that we're offering at the beginning of this coming year, where they can learn to use the capnometer and really learn how to do CO2 work and to be able to really monitor respiration real time. You can't do it with an oximeter. And you can't do it really with any other instrument that you would ever have available, where you can really integrate respiration in what you're doing. And so we have a program that really puts that together for you. There's practicum associated with it and so on. And then if you're interested, you can go on. We have a breathing behavior analysis professional diploma program and certification as a breathing behavior analyst associated with it. And then there's the master's degree we've been doing, but right now we're not offering the master's degree. We will again soon, but we're not at the moment. But we have these programs, and we really invite you to come in and to consider bringing respiration into your work. I mean, you could add another whole component to what you're doing. It adds a lot of credibility to what you're doing, and people are fascinated by it, and it really can get you involved in breathing in a whole different way. It's really very interesting and exciting, not only to you, but the people you might be working with.
Yeah. I think people that are watching this will have had their eyes opened in a few areas during this podcast. So thank you. So we're going to link to all of your areas and websites below, Dr. Litchfield, so people can find that. Thank you again for your time. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you everybody for watching.
Same here.
See you on next one. Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank
Cheers,
you so
everyone.
much.
Cheers.
Thank everybody.
Hey, thank you so much for sticking all the way through to the end of that podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I just have a quick question for you. Would you do us a favor and leave us a comment down below with one thing that you learned from the podcast, or one thing that you want to take away and implement into your own life? And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our Breathwork in a Blink. It's our 5-minute easy read newsletter. It comes out every single Friday. And in that, I'm sharing things like my favorite breathing exercise of the week, a study that I've been reading on breathing. We've got a wild card section. We've got all these different bits, and it's been designed so you can read it and scan through it in less than 5 minutes and pick out something you'd like to go deeper on. It's completely free. You can unsubscribe anytime and join the nearly 10,000 other people that have subscribed to this wonderful email newsletter. Link is down below, and I look forward to serving you each and every Friday.